Hello friends to my Pauper Flophouse. This week I'm gonna be running down Goblins, one of the several mono red decks in the Pauper format. I'm doing one of the mono red decks first because as there's a few different ones, I want to spread them out a little bit so it's not too samey, to have multiple of the red decks in a row. I chose Goblins because I like some Goblins, and I think it's a bit less played than the other Pauper red decks. Like the straight burn deck, pretty sure is the most commonly played one, but it's followed not too far behind by the red deck wins style that has a bunch of hasty 2/2s rather than a bunch of more War Marshals. So here's the deck. There's a few different ways to build it. I will discuss some of the cards I'm not playing in the article going up on Nuot Gaming fairly soon. But here I've split it up into the various parts of the deck. Here we have some glorious mountainy mana base. There's not even any cycling lands because you really don't want to have to play any of your lands tapped. So we're just YOLOing it and playing a mere 18 mountains. The 1-drop slot is very important, so as you can see there's a ton of them. We have the squad of 2/2s, which can only attack if you've cast a creature spell, thus the rest of the deck is influenced into having the bare minimum burn spells, basically. Loads of creatures. Foundry Street Denizen is also, pretty good as a 1-drop, but gets a little bit sketchy sometimes, and people are bringing in Electricaries and Shrivels and that sort of thing. It's much better a lot of the time to have 2/2s. And we also have some Goblin Arsonist, which I think is the worst 1-drop by quite a lot. I have definitely considered playing some Goblin Patrol in here, the Echo one, but I'll stick with what's, relatively commonly played at the minute, just to give you a better idea of what to expect when you see this deck. Kept aside from the 1-drops are the Sliders and Raiders. They're basically identical, they have identical text. And I think they're one of the big reasons that you want to play a deck like this, because they give you a lot of flexibility with being able to evade blockers and play around tricks and that sort of thing. Without these, if these were just some other random 1/1 or maybe even 2/1s, I think this deck could be a lot worse. Goblin Bushwhackers, common in every red deck with tons of creatures. Its damage output is quite high. It's actually worse than Arsonist as a 1-drop, because obviously you want to play this for 2 mana and get at least 3 or 4 damage from it, but you hope to have a bunch of creatures in play to get more. And to power up these Goblin... So far there aren't that many reasons to actually play Goblins other than these. So to power up the Sliders and Raiders, we have Mog War Marshal over here, which also goes well with Bushwhacker. This gives you a surprising amount of resiliency. This always seems like it should be a bit underwhelming, and if you're just casting it on turn 2 and then paying Echo and then doing nothing with it, it is a bit underwhelming. But it actually gives you a lot of staying power, ability to manage combat, especially in conjunction with these types of creatures. And to me, one of the other reasons to play Goblins is Sparksmith. Now, this is obviously very bad in certain matchups where they're burning your face off, but against decks like Affinity, if you get this online fast enough, then this can just dominate other creature decks. So I think it's one of the reasons that you would play a deck like this. And finally, not everyone has a Goblin Heel Cutter, but I think more or less everyone should have one. It's at the top of your curve as a 3 mana dash card. but it fulfills a few rules. Obviously, it's has its text on it, which can help your other creatures in combat, but it also helps you attack multiple times with your conscripts and cohorts. If your opponent's putting up a lot of resistance and have killed your early creatures and you're drawing cohorts and conscripts in the late game, then sometimes you just can't attack them. So having, your miser cohort enablers is quite good. It also just wins some games that otherwise were unwinnable. Like if they just have like a bunch of Chainers Edicts and Innocent Bloods in their hand, sometimes you'll just kill them with this 3/2 dash creature which comes back to your hand, so they just can't kill it, which is nice. I've never actually hard cast this yet, but I've always been pretty happy every time I've drawn it, so it's definitely in contention for playing more of them. I don't have any Goblin Matrons because I think they're a bit on the slow side, but I could easily see, I can understand why people play them because it gives you a little bit of versatility with the toolbox of, find a Sparksmith or find a War Marshal, find Heel Cutter. Like I say, I don't like them too much myself because I think they're a bit on the expensive side for what they do. I'm playing 3 Fire Blasts rather than either 4 or like 1 Miser Fire Blast. I think Fire Blast is a fantastic game 1 card, so I'm always happy to draw a copy in game 1. Game 2 they quite often come out because you really want this to be the last spell that's cast in a game, and once your opponent sideboards into a bunch of things which can crush red decks, you quite often find yourself, with a few creatures in play, top decking Fire Blasts and never being able to cast one. Death Spark is one that pops up sometimes in these decks, not always, but I think it's surprisingly good at grinding people out. As you can tell, there's lots of creatures in the deck. So if the opponent is, killing off all your creatures one by one, you can levy this Death Spark to deal quite a lot of damage over the course of the game. And if they happen to have 1 toughness creatures, then great, you can, start assassinating them with Death Spark. Sometimes it's underwhelming and it's another often sideboarded option. To be fair, most of the creatures don't get sideboarded out because they all need other creatures to be good. So it's mostly the spells that get sideboarded for other more specific spells. Lightning bolts are just a sort of auto-include in aggressive or controlling red decks, just all red decks really. So the sideboard, we have nothing too out of the ordinary. Silphic Lifestaff is actually one I think is quite a fair reason to play Goblins over some other red decks, because this just crushes other red decks when you get it going a little bit. If your opponent's trying to Lightning Bolt you and Lava Spike you, and then you have Mog War Marshal with a Silphic Lifestaff and you just gain 12 life, I don't see how you can lose those games other than, being horribly, horribly flooded. It also lets your 1/1s trade up to the 2/2s in the red deck wins varieties of red. So it's just a huge house in that sort of matchup. We have Force Smash to Smithereens. I like this because against things like Affinity, Gorilla Shaman is obviously super if you get it early enough and you can just destroy other lands. But a lot of the time the problem against Affinity is, well, Mirror Enforcers and things like that. So being able to blow up things is nice. I also like it more against the other decks that have artifacts, like the Tron decks. I'm really not excited at all to board in like Gorilla Shaman or something if somebody's playing like Prophetic Prisms and Expedition maps, because you quite often just can't do anything. But Smash to Smithereens is basically like an upgrade to Lightning Bolt most of the time against those decks, since they'll almost always have targets, and it's replaces a burn spell, so you're not like cutting down on any reach. Molten Rains to disrupt, disrupt decks that require a bunch of mana, especially the ones with the Ravnica bounce lands. It's always great there. Some people play Raise, which is a 1 mana LD spell, but also requires you to sacrifice a land, and I've had bad experiences with Raise. Since you've got such a low land count yourself, you quite often just can't afford to raise them before turn 3 anyway, because otherwise you can't cast any more spells, thus defeating the purpose. And obviously, situationally, like, Raise is better, but I like Molten Rain, and it still keeps your amount of burn high, especially if you're having to board out Fire Blasts and that sort of thing, because they've got tons of Circle Protection Reds and Rest for the Wearies and Dispels and all that sort of nonsense. Pyroblast is just a amazing anti-blue card, and blue is very popular, so yeah. And Electric Rays are sort of miser card against things like Boggles, like other elves, I guess. So yeah, I quite like this deck. It always feels when you're playing this deck like you're sort of losing because you're playing a bunch of 1/1s, and you quite often manage to defeat them anyway. So I'm looking forward to seeing how these games go.